Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Troy Public Library. I'm Anna Barlow, an Adult Services Librarian here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Triumphant Tales of Wildlife Conservation in Michigan. Our presenter is Rachel Leitner, Wildlife Outreach Coordinator with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. She is going to share some incredible tales of wildlife conservation success in Michigan. We are going to learn how the bold actions of compassionate hunters, natural resource professionals, and nature enthusiasts have led to the recovery of some of Michigan's most iconic species, from the Peregrine Falcons to white-tailed deer. And with that, I will turn this over to Rachel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Anna, so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk about all things wildlife and natural resources, and thanks to you folks who have tuned in to share your Thursday evening with me. It is a beautiful night outside, and so I really do appreciate you sitting in to chat about wildlife with me. I am Rachel Leitner. I'm a Wildlife Outreach Coordinator for the Michigan DNR Wildlife Division, and I'm here to talk about conservation success, and specifically some of the success that we've seen with some key species that we have here in Michigan. They'll likely be species that you've heard of, that you've observed, and so I'm going to talk about why we're able to observe them today, and basically where these wildlife populations started, where we're at with them now, and what got us here. So I will also preface this by saying I can talk really fast, and I like talking about this stuff. So if at any point I start talking too fast, please, Anna, please feel free to tell me to slow down. But I would be happy to field any questions you've got towards the end of the presentation. So I thought we would just briefly start with what is wildlife conservation. Now, so many of us have some idea of what wildlife conservation is. Hopefully all of us have seen some type of wildlife species, even if it's the American robin in your backyard. That still counts. That's still a very important species. But really, it just means, what are we doing to make sure we have abundant and diverse wildlife in Michigan? And what are we doing to protect our natural resources? Now, as so many of us know, Michigan is a treasure trove for natural resources, and so much of who we are as a state is dependent on those natural resources. And a lot of that also ties into wildlife conservation. So, you know, by definition, it's the practice of protecting wild species and their wild places in order to maintain healthy wildlife species populations and restore, protect, and enhance natural ecosystems. So there is a lot that falls within wildlife conservation wheelhouse. And so I'm just going to give you some very general overviews of the kind of conservation work that we have been doing to restore specific species. Now, conservation is not new. It is by no means a new topic. It's been around since Michigan has been around since the end of the last glacial meltings. You know, even dating back to prior to European settlement, Native Americans were phenomenal stewards of this land, and they are the reason why we have such pristine conditions that we have in some of these areas in Michigan. So conservation isn't new, but what we've seen and what we're going to see is that the techniques we use to conserve wildlife are ever evolving. So, you know, the systems, the tools, the techniques that we used 50 years ago are not going to be what we use 50 years from now. And so I want to talk about some of the history that the different things that we've done to conserve species in the past, and what we're kind of looking at doing in the future, to give you a range of the different types of tools we use to help wildlife really flourish here in Michigan. And before I start talking about our future progress, we have to note that there has substantial work that has been done over the last 100 years. 2021, this year, is the 100th year of conservation, which means it's basically the 100th year of DNR officially, formally. A lot of remarkable work has gone into conservation in the last 100 years, and I easily could spend the next hour talking about those things that have happened in the last year. I mean, everything from protecting our lands, our wildlife, our water, our air, the different types of conservation efforts that have occurred, restoration of wildlife species, protecting rare and endangered species. I mean, the list could really, it could go on, and we could talk a long time about all of the remarkable work that has happened. And I also want to preface that when I refer to we from here on out, I do not solely mean the DNR. So when we talk about conservation and when we talk about conservation success, the we is a collective of all of the people that are involved, because conservation would not be successful without the partners that are involved in it. So the DNR, other state agencies, federal agencies, private organizations, tribal nations, volunteer groups, community efforts. Every story I'm going to share with you today is a result of the partnerships, the collaboration that went into making these species be around for us now and for future generations. But over the last 100 years, you know, the DNR specifically in collaboration with our partners have done a lot of tremendous work. And we're very proud to be here, to be the agency that we are, and to have the natural resources that we've been able to dedicate so much time and effort into preserving and conserving. There are a few dates that I wanted to touch on because they will be very relevant to the rest of our talk. The first one, 1921, Michigan legislature decides that we have a Department of Conservation. So this is where we get our start. We will be renamed the Department of Natural Resources in 1968. So, you know, 47-ish years, we were the Department of Conservation. And occasionally you can find some really old, super cool DNR memorabilia or magazines or clothing that say Department of Conservation on them. So if you ever see that, just know that that's what the DNR was initially. And then in 1933, something really substantial happens, and that's the Michigan Civilian Conservation Corps comes around. And Franklin Roosevelt was responsible for putting that initiative into action, and it makes way in 1933. Now, the CCC camps have, there's remnants of them all around us all of the time, and we might not even notice it. So they were responsible for restocking forests after the late 1800s logging boom. So Michigan becomes a state in the late 1800s, and basically we need to settle the land. We need homes, we need shelter, we need to be able to feed our family and provide for ourselves. And so in a lot of ways, while we grow as a society, natural resources takes a hit, and we strip whole forests, we deplete the soils because there are no plants growing, because we're using the plants, we're using the trees. We hunt a lot of the wildlife, some of them completely removed from the landscape. And it's just, you know, it's the reality of the situation. We needed these resources, we used them, it depleted them from Michigan's landscape. Well, the CCC comes in and they begin to replant. And so in a lot of places, they replant these huge red pine plantations because red pines can grow really well in soils that don't have any nutrients to them because they grow really well in sand. And so I'm sure there are some of us that have our favorite forest to go for a hike on is these huge red pine stands. And if you look at how they're planted, they will be planted in perfect rows. And those are remnants of the CCC camps and the tremendous work that they were able to do to recover huge swaths of Michigan's landscapes. And from there, you know, the landscapes really evolved, but they were quintessential in some of the beginning works of conservation in Michigan. In '66, we've got the Federal Endangered Species Act. Obviously, this is important. It prioritizes the species that need the most help. It tells us these need to be our priorities. They are going to go extinct if you don't do anything. It's super important that this happens. And then in 1973, the Non-Game Wildlife Fund is created. Now, game species, a huntable species where we can sell a hunting license or fishing license, those dollars go into funding conservation further for those game species. And when it comes to a non-game animal like a frog, a toad, a bird, we don't hunt those. We don't have a license amount for them. And so the non-game fund is a way of funding conservation for those non-game species. And it really does really impactful work for our rare and endangered species. Now, the biggest contributor to the Non-Game Wildlife Fund is the Non-Game Wildlife license plate. And maybe some of you who are on this call have that license plate. It's got the elk on it. Prior to that, it had the loon on it. But if you have that license plate, I can assure you your money is going to good use. It's being well spent on non-game habitat, non-game wildlife conservation. And so these are big things that happened for Michigan's conservation. And there is one more, and I pulled this one out because it's really relevant right now. In 1937, the Wildlife Restoration Act passes, which is also known as the Pittman-Robertson Fund. And this is a big generator of money for wildlife conservation today. So what this is the United States legislature put through this bill, which basically says that all of the tax on firearms and ammunition will be moved into a pool to only be used for wildlife management, wildlife habitat, education. I mean, you can see the list there on your screen. It's $21 million a year that's used for all of these different things. And it funds so much of what we do. And it's also been an enormous shaping movement in how we're able to manage wildlife and manage habitat. And I say that it's relevant right now because we're in this really interesting moment here in 2021, and there's currently a piece of legislation that's moving through the United States legislature that is similar in magnitude, and that's called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA for short. Now, this bill has a lot of money associated with it that could potentially be used for wildlife habitat and wildlife conservation, in addition to a whole slew of other things. And it could have, you know, this right now I'm talking about something that happened in 1937. 50 years from now, they could be talking about RAWA. I mean, it has tremendous, it could have tremendous impact on what we do. And I also say that's relevant because the Wildlife Restoration Act passed during the Great Depression. They chose to prioritize wildlife and natural resources in a time when it was hard to live, essentially. And by no means am I saying that today's time is similar to the Great Depression. I'm just saying that why not now? You know, we're in a challenging time. History could repeat itself. RAWA certainly has a long way to go, and I will admit I don't know the finite details of it because it's a bill. It's going through all of the things that our legislation goes through, but it is something to certainly keep an ear to the ground on if you're interested in conservation. We do have other sources of conservation funding. I just wanted to quickly touch on that the PR fund does not solely fund conservation, but as I mentioned, the sale of hunting and fishing license is tremendous. Hunters and anglers fund a lot of conservation. That when you buy a license, that money is going into the pot to be used for conservation of some sort. PR fund, we just mentioned. The non-game fund, we also mentioned. It's the non-game wildlife license plate, huge money generator for non-game species. But then we also work with partners. I mean, there are so many partners that we work with that provide funding, but they also provide sweat equity in a lot of ways. You got to have somebody to pay for it, and you got to have somebody to carry it out. And we have a lot of really wonderful partners who help get this work done. And then, of course, there's various other grants and grant programs, and I'm sure that there are a lot of other funding sources that we use. I'm just going to highlight these ones because they're relevant to our success stories that we are going to get into now. And what does it look like when conservation funding is happening. What's the outcome? It's this. So, each one of these pictures is conservation. It's conservation at its best, really. I mean, in the top left corner there, we've got species management. That's a bear in the middle of a bear den check, where we will put a collar on a mother so that we can track her movements to see where she's moving to. Bears are moving all across Michigan all the time, so it's very important that we track where they're at, while also collecting biological data from her and her cubs. In the middle there, that what seems to be a large fire is actually a very controlled, well-maintained fire. It's a prescribed fire. We burn specific landscapes because it provides a multitude of benefits to wildlife and to the environment. It's very good for those soils in a lot of cases. Again, we've got species management. In the bottom, we've got outreach and communications on state lands. I mean, this picture here was taken at someone donated a state game area, an enormous parcel of land to now be open for public use. And so we're just working with the community to figure out, what do you want to see on this public land? Sometimes dam removal also falls into the wildlife conservation wheelhouse. That's what's going on in that middle picture. That's the removal of a dam in Kalamazoo. That falls into our wheelhouse because that water impacts wildlife, and therefore we've got to do something about it. And then, of course, we're managing for recreational opportunities, and we want conservation to last for our future generations. So we're getting those young generations involved in conservation, but also the things that make Michigan, Michigan. I mean, hunting especially is rooted in traditions of Michigan and its early statehood. And so all of this is just to show you that the dollars that you spend towards conservation, they're being put to use, and we're able to do some pretty remarkable work with it. Now, these species, I do want to say that each one of these species I could easily talk for an hour. So I'm going to give you the brief overview of the history of what has happened with these species and where their populations are at now. And if you want to ask me questions at the end, please feel free. So I'm going to start with one of my most favorite species in Michigan, and that is the wood duck. They are brilliantly colored small ducks with this iridescent plumage throughout their whole body. I mean, you can see the eye alone makes it super unique, but to see the rest of its colors, they're really beautiful birds. And they also nest in precarious places. So they'll nest in tree cavities between 15 to 50 feet high in a tree, which is not a common place to see a duck. You typically think that they'll be on the water. And of course, they live near water. That's primarily how they eat, but they live in the trees and they have their babies in the trees. And so in the springtime, it's not uncommon to see a small fluff floating down from 50 feet in the air. And a lot of times we get phone calls with concerned citizens that they're seeing these ducklings jump out of the tree, bounce off the ground, and rest assured they're okay. They don't weigh enough to break anything or hurt themselves. They have evolved. They have been doing this since the dawn of the wood duck. And so should you see that next spring, just know it's nature, and amazingly they can survive it. So wood ducks were around prior to European settlement, but they did see a rapid decline in the 1800s, and that is mostly due to, as I mentioned, the logging boom. We removed a lot of wildlife habitat, and then we hunted them really hard. There was no regulations, there were no bag limits, there was nothing to tell anyone how many ducks were available, how many ducks they should be shooting. And so we basically hunted them to extirpation, which means they were removed from Michigan's landscape. Not totally extinct. They were found in other places, but they were gone from Michigan for quite some time. And then around the 1915 time frame, is when wood duck hunting, becomes banned. But then around the 1930s, somebody, likely a hunter or someone who was appreciated and liked watching wood ducks realizes that they're gone and that we should be doing something. And so they start to build artificial nest boxes, which is basically just some wood slats with small hole placed high up in the tree. And it works. It's very much if you build it, they will come scenario. So they really just need a place, a secure place to live, those nest boxes, because with no trees, there's no nest cavities. If you put the next boxes back up, we immediately started to see an increase in their populations. And then in addition to the extensive wetland and forest habitat management that starts to go on, as I mentioned, the CCC camps, they really start to work in forests and wetlands. We see an increase happen. Wood duck populations begin to flourish. And now today, their populations are thriving, and we have a lot of wood ducks, and we have enough to have hunting seasons, with higher bag limits than initially. They're common to see, and they're so common that Michigan has become a global destination for people to come see wood ducks. They are rare in other parts of the world, and so every year when the wood ducks arrive, there are people from all across the country and the world who will come to see these truly amazing birds. We're able to do a lot with them, really, but every year we band. So we'll catch them there in the bottom. That orange box is a wood duck box. We trap them every year. We actually hire huge crews of people across the whole state to trap the wood ducks and band them. The band, you can see the silver bracelet on their little legs. This is actually a mallard on the left-hand side, but you get the picture of what we're doing here. And then we track their movements. And when a hunter harvests them in the fall season, no matter where they are in the country, we'll be able to see the flight patterns and where those wood ducks are moving to. Now, this species is one that actually preys on the wood ducks, and that's the peregrine falcon. These are remarkable birds. They are some of the fastest birds, if not the fastest bird in the world, because it dives at 200 miles an hour, which is just remarkable. And in some areas where they have peregrine falcons, they'll know that they have peregrine falcons, not by hearing or seeing, but by seeing what they leave behind, which is often a plume of feathers from a bird that they've caught midair, because they can just dive right down, grab a bird, and be gone, and you'll never even know. You'll just see the feathers floating in the air. They're quite remarkable. Now, these peregrine falcons, we suspect that we had 10 to 15 pairs in northern Michigan prior to settlement. We don't really know, but that's what we think. And they mostly lived along cliff faces or forested bluffs. They're a predator species, and so they need a vantage point or a bird's eye view to be able to see prey below and dive to feed. So forested bluffs, cliff faces like that is traditionally where they were found. But then they disappeared in the 1950s, and they have a very similar story as bald eagles or a lot of other animals that are higher in the food chain, and because their numbers were damaged because of environmental toxins. So chemicals like DDT and PCBs, lots of us have heard the story of how these toxins leached into the environment, and they lead to an accumulation within these species that eat other wildlife species. So DDT comes into the ground, it grows in the grass, then the rabbit eats the grass, then the peregrine falcon eats the rabbit. Meanwhile, DDT doesn't break down from their bodies, so it's just accumulating into the top of the food chain, and it really hurts some of our predators in our food chain, and it hurt the peregrine falcon. Now, the DDT, it sickens them, overall just worsens their health. But with this particular species, we also saw that it really had an impact on the shells that these peregrine eggs were laying to hatch their chicks out of. And a lot of times the eggs were just too thin. It really was whatever it takes to make an egg. It was really inhibiting that its resources and its nutrients. And so the eggs were just crushed by the parents trying to incubate them, and it essentially caused extinction or extirpation of peregrine falcons on Michigan's landscape. So conservation of these falcons would not be possible unless those environmental contaminants were banned. And that goes for so many of our wildlife species, and frankly, for the health of our human population as well. And so thankfully in the 70s, they're banned and we can get to work. Now, peregrine falcons, much like so many of the other species I'll mention, it took a lot of work from a lot of different agencies and partners to band together to make this restoration effort work. Conservation agencies, federal, state, public, private, all came together to supply resources and expertise to figure out a way to bring these birds back, because it wasn't going to be easy. And the strategy that we ended up going with was captive breeding and release programs. And basically that means, we're taking a captive pair, we're breeding them in captivity, and then we're taking their eggs and we're moving them outside to release, or we're releasing the babies out into the wild. Now that works well in some cases. However, oftentimes offspring need parents to teach them how to be wild. They need to be taught how to fend for themselves, how to care for themselves. If you raise them in captivity with captive parents, they're not going to learn the skills that they need to be a wild animal. And so we had to get creative with how we were going to do these programs. And it took some ingenuity, that's for sure. What we ended up coming up with was these devices called hack boxes. And I'll advance the slide and you can see in this bottom right photo, that is a hack box. And essentially, this is a device that we raised chicks in. So it's a large box. It's got that barred metal door on one side, and then on the other side, it's got this swinging hinged door. And so when the chicks are, when they're old enough to eat, but they're not yet ready to fly, we supplied them food. We would put the food in through the door. They would eat. They wouldn't see us. They're not ready to fly yet, so they're not going to go anywhere, but we kept them in the box and we fed them while acclimating them to a place where they could survive, which was a modern day cliff face, is an urban skyscraper in a downtown city. They thrive in urban areas because these tall skyscrapers essentially mimic their traditional home ranges and habitats, which were cliff faces. So then once these chicks are ready to fly, we'll drop down that barred side and they're free to go. And amazingly, this works. It works well. It worked so well, in fact, that we started to see birds in 1988. We observed our first pair. They weren't reproductively successful at that point, but it was still it was great to see that they were there. Now we've got over 30 nesting sites, so this has certainly been a successful reintroduction. And you can see here in these pictures, we've got fledglings in the top right corner. They're super adorable, but they're on the sides of skyscrapers. And while you're reaching out there to band them, you get the sight of this on the top left here. That's a mother peregrine falcon, and she's obviously not happy that we are going in to band and make sure that those babies are doing okay. Next, we have the Kirklands Warbler. Now, this is another, we could talk forever about it, but basically, this little yellow bird is only found in very specific areas in Northeast Michigan, and it declined. More of a three-pronged approach to why this one declined. I mean, it too needs very specific trees to grow out of that were removed with the logging boom. It needs jack pines, and it needs a lot of jack pines, at least 80 acres of it to be successful. But there also were a few other prongs that caused the decline of this bird, and that was the introduction of the brown-headed cowbird. Now, the brown-headed cowbird is a nest parasite, and it's a Basically, it's a freeloader. This bird doesn't make its own nest. It finds the nests of other birds, lays its eggs there, and other parents raise their young. And in turn, a lot of times, the Kirkland Warbler would raise the cowbird eggs and not its own. And so it suffered huge loss in reproductive success. And then also, these birds actually need fire to thrive, because the jack pine species that it lives in, the pine cones of a jack pine require fire to open up to drop their seedlings. And during times of settlement, we suppressed wildfires. We didn't want it to burn our new cities. And we still have a good deal of wildfire suppression these days, but we have to choose other management options in a lot of ways. And we do prescribe fire in particular scenarios where it's okay. But because we were suppressing fire, these birds basically, their numbers really plummeted. And in the 1950s, we did a census and we found 1,000 birds, which is not very many birds. And then the Endangered Species Act comes into fruition and it becomes a legal document. And the Kirkland's Warbler is one of the very first species to be listed on the Endangered Species Act. And that basically prioritizes, we are going to manage for Kirkland's warblers in these areas where jack pine grow. It becomes a priority for other states in the Midwest, and we really get to work. So intensive habitat management occurs. Here you can see in that top screen there, that is timber management for jack pine forests. Basically, we're farming these jack pine trees. We keep them, we need them young and thick to grow best. And so once the jack pines have grown up to be too mature, we cut them, we replant, and we do it in swaths big enough for Kirkland's Warbler to really survive. So in a way, we use the, it's timber management. We're going to sell those trees to the timber industry, but also this little yellow bird requires this kind of management. And then on the left there, we've got the cute little eggs. They lay them in the ground in the pine needles of the jack pine. And this is one of our greatest successes in 2018. With 4,500 birds counted, the Kirkland's Warbler was removed from the Endangered Species Act. So this was a huge partner effort. We do annual surveys, and the goal here and the reason why it was successful and why it will continue to be successful is because of the long-term management that we're doing and the long-term partners that are involved. This butterfly is the Conner blue butterfly, and it also requires fire. So this little blue butterfly that is the size of a dime and is quite beautiful. It only lives in about 4,000 acres in about 10 counties. So the equivalent is 10 counties in Southwest Michigan. So you don't have these in Troy or really near there yet. You may never, it's very hard to say, but we spend a lot of time conserving for this little butterfly and animals that use the same type of habitat as it, which is so many. These typically are found in open prairies, savannas, grasslands, where there's an unbelievable amount of songbirds, pollinators, deer, turkey. Both game and non-game species benefit from the management for this Conner blue butterfly. But it's been in peril because it requires lupin, and lupin, the flower, it requires intensive management. So this is a lupin. It's a native Michigan species, so it's been around since the glaciers melted. And the Conner blue, or KBB, you also will hear them referred to as KBB, and they require lupin. It's what they lay their eggs on, it's what they eat, it's what the caterpillars eat. And so we have to make sure we have an abundant lupin wherever lupin will grow naturally. And how do we manage for that? Intensively. Lupin does not like shade, and it does not do well in shade. And so we will prescribe fire at very specific times of the year to basically burn off any woody vegetation, so bushes, shrubs, small trees. We need them gone in order to grow lupin, in order for us to help this species. The same as mowing. Mowing works too, however, we have to do it in the wintertime when we have at least 4 inches of snow. There are very specific parameters for when when we can manage for the species, because we don't want to hurt it or damage it in any way. And while they're overwintering under the snow, we need about a 4-inch buffer so that we don't hurt the species while we're managing for it. In Michigan, there are numerous research projects that are going on. You know, DNR, United States Fish and Wildlife Service, Michigan Natural Features Inventory. There's various nature centers and universities all working on finding a way to preserve this species. Now, white-tailed deer, anyone in Michigan probably has an opinion on white-tailed deer and white-tailed deer management. There's a lot of opinions to consider when it comes to deer management, but they are certainly a conservation success because, like so many of these species, after the logging boom, huge issues with their populations, though they were once, they were very abundant in southern Michigan. I just learned in researching for this talk that they were not abundant in northern Michigan, and that's because there were elk and moose up there at the time, and so there was really no food left for the deer, and so they were steady and healthy in southern Michigan. Now, when the logging boom occurred and unregulated hunting hurts deer numbers, the deer actually move north and they find a way to survive up there amongst the elk and the moose. However, the railroads come in, hunting pressure moves up north, and so eventually their numbers decline up in northern Michigan as well. Now, really, what helps the deer herd the most? The ban on market hunting. I mean, in addition to feeding our families, we also were shooting deer, selling deer. We were shooting all these wildlife species, and we were selling them as a trade system. Excuse me. And once the ban on market hunting happens, and regulated hunting with a limited take, is when the deer population really begins to evolve and bounce back. And then, of course, as habitat management, timber management, as we start to regrow forests, deer populations regrow as well. And deer really like young, early growth. And so as those CCC camps come in, they start to replant, the forest regrows, the deer population begins to grow again. However, the population for deer continues to fluctuate, and it really is, it's like a cyclical event. It goes up and it goes down based on the deer population and their food availability. And we still see this today in a lot of areas. Basically, as the deer population grows bigger, it begins to run out of food, and that's when we see starvation happen. So then the population will go back down into decline, and then when there are less deer, there's more food sources. So then the population begins to regrow, and this sort of fluctuation happens for several decades before 1980 rolls around. The DNR decides we will have a goal of 1 million deer, and that's when they really start managing the habitat to sustain a population of 1 million deer. Now we've got today, we probably have 1 million deer. Deer hunting is open in every county. We have a pretty liberal season. You can take really as many does as you want. In Michigan, some people don't think we have enough deer in particular areas. Some people live in extremely urban areas and have a tough time living so close to deer. So deer conservation is ever evolving, but we certainly do a lot of work for deer. Deer hunting is highly sought after in Michigan. It's, the sale of deer licenses funds a lot of conservation. And so we do a lot of work with it. We have various research projects, we collect data, we do a lot of management, and it's a conservation effort I don't see changing anytime soon because it's ever evolving. Next up is the deer's cousin, the elk. Now the elk have a very interesting story. They disappeared again from unregulated hunting, but we actually reintroduced these guys. So in 1918, we brought 7 elk in by the train I saw a replica of it once. We just literally put 7 elk on a train and we brought them to Wolverine, and we let them go because at that time we had started managing the land. These elk they're big animals, they need a lot of room to eat. And so we start maintaining these huge areas to let elk eat. You'll see, we've got plantings to keep them in a particular area. We make sure that there's open spaces where they eat because they primarily eat in big, large open spaces. And as the population grows, we begin to experience poaching because elk do eat a lot. And when they move out of this very specific area where we want them to be, if they move into a farmer's field, they're going to do damage to a cornfield or a bean field. And it'll be substantial. And so we saw as the population grew, poaching also grew. And that's when the population drops back down. So we develop a management plan. We manage intensively to keep animals in a specific spot and at a specific population number. We begin regulated hunting, and it's a very hands-on hunting season. We only issue 260 tags right now, and it's a species that we manage very intensively for and very carefully, but it's been successful. We have approximately 1,000 elk now in Northeast Michigan. Now, wild turkeys, this is probably one of the most successful stories we've got. We went from 94,000 birds prior to settlement down to 0. They were totally removed from overhunting, but then we reintroduced them in the 1950s. We brought them in from Pennsylvania. We managed the land for turkeys. So again, they need big open spaces like so many of these other species do, and they thrived. It took several reintroductions, lots of habitat management, but we were able to hold the first hunt in 1965. We've had a turkey hunting season almost every year since then, and turkeys are also very comfortable living in urban areas. So part of this is the management that we've done, but also the species itself. It's very comfortable living in the wild. It's also very comfortable living in urban settings, which is important as we see communities grow. Now we have well over 200,000 birds, so we've got a healthy turkey population. And these are pictures from the first reintroduction efforts. In the top left there, that's actually our senior pathologist now. He's been with us a long time. And he's putting a turkey in a cardboard box to later take it to the field and release it. We've got, down in the bottom right, he's planting apple trees that we've grown. So we did a lot of intensive plantings that were very intentional for turkey habitat, and it really led to the success of such a healthy population that we have today. And I would be remiss to not talk about Michigan's flying mammal species, and that's the bat. Now we have 9 species of bats in Michigan. Several of them are on the endangered species list or are considered threatened or a species of special concern in Michigan. And they need some help because they are under extreme threat in Michigan. And I did just also want to note that bats consume up to 1,000 mosquito-sized insects per hour. And based on the mosquito experience I have had this summer, I would advocate for bat conservation. I think we all can appreciate bats based on their ability to remove mosquitoes from the landscape. But their numbers are dwindling and they're declining at increasing speeds. And that's because of the white nose syndrome. Now, white nose syndrome is a fungus that grows in the hibernacula of where these bats live. So old caves, old mine shafts, basically the hibernacula is where they spend the winter. So where they're sleeping during the winter time, this fungus will attach to the face of a bat and wake them up during hibernation. And when they wake up, they fly outside, and because they're hibernating, their metabolic rate is so low, they haven't eaten, they haven't drank anything, and it is so taxing on their body for them to wake up in the middle of hibernation that they die. So we find mass die-offs in the wintertime from white nose syndrome. And so there is so much conservation work happening right now to try to minimize human disturbance during hibernacula, because we don't want to spread white nose syndrome. We don't want to spread fungal pores from one place to another. We also are trying potential treatments for white nose syndrome. And actually on this screen, you can see white nose. So there on the top left, that's what it looks like. And so we're trying all of these different trials with different chemicals and actually trying to treat the white nose syndrome in the bats. We're gating off access to the caves and their hibernacula. You can see there on the bottom left, that's an old mine where bats are found. We're blocking human disturbances from there and not letting people go in there anymore. We're trying to educate the public on what's happening and what they can do. And we're also cleaning hibernacula. I mean, we're using chlorine dioxide to clean the fungal spores. We're also testing out different temperatures in these places because there may potentially be a link between cold temperatures and low growth of fungal spores. But all of this to say is that there is tremendous amounts of conservation work going into this species right now. And if you're interested in wanting to help bats, there are resources out there where you can get involved. I mean, the Non-Game Wildlife Fund funds so much of bat conservation, but there's also local research projects, partnerships, bat boxes, schematics for how to build a bat box. All of that information is out there. And of course, if you'd like to be pointed in the right direction, I would be happy to do that. So those are just a few of the species. The list goes on. The work is really never done. There are so many species that require further conservation, that require additional management. If you like fish, I mean, lake sturgeon, Arctic grayling, those are huge projects that are ongoing and have been successful. Turtles, salamanders, woodcock, I mean, there's an entire list of things that we could have talked about today, but just know that the work is always ongoing. And it will continue to keep going because of people who cannot live without wild things. And the father of modern day conservation, Aldo Leopold, said that there are some people who can live without wild things and there are some who cannot. Conservation, and especially successful conservation, is only possible because of the people who simply cannot live with wild things. And if you are still listening to this talk, you are probably in that group of people who cannot live with wild things. And so be you a hunter, an angler, a birder, a hiker, someone who enjoys butterflies or snakes, whatever it is, these conservation successes are happening because of you and because of the efforts that you are willing to put in. Us DNR professionals, we love our jobs, but it can't all be done by us. And so all of this work is possible through the multiple agencies, the conservation organizations, the volunteer efforts, the communities. I mean, it really is the fruit of what these really valuable partnership efforts have been able to do. If you do want to get involved, there are ways. I mean, conservation is ever ongoing, and if you're interested in helping to further conservation, there are things that you can do. The first, you can donate. You can donate to the Non-Game Wildlife Funds. That's money that'll be put to use. If you can purchase a hunting and fishing license that will also go directly into wildlife conservation. You can research what to put in your landscaping or in your gardening. Native species especially are very important to plant, one for our native wildlife, but also to fight invasive species. I mean, so many of the invasive species that we have right now came from someone's yard. If you buy a nice bush from the Home Depot and it has berries on it, and a bird will eat it and it will poop out those berries somewhere else. And that is how a lot of invasive species get started. Also, pay attention to what you buy. Oriental bittersweet is a really terrible invasive species right now. And that happens because it's a beautiful vine that grows on the mantle that you put on your mantle at Christmas time. It's a Christmas decoration that was thrown away and ended up in a landfill, and its seeds grew, and now it is one of the worst invasive species we have in Michigan. So just spend a little extra time, think about what you're putting in the ground, what you're buying. And then of course you can always volunteer. Michigan United Conservation Clubs, there are species specific. So if you like turkeys or ducks or salamanders, there's a group out there for you. Classrooms, local facilities. If you're interested in putting in a rain garden or some native vegetation, get a hold of us. We'd be more than happy to help you put together a species list or an idea of what you can do. But all of these little things, they matter because they do add up. You can actually make a difference with some of these choices. And there, as I mentioned, there's so many different ways to contribute to conservation. And so if you feel compelled to, you can find a way. And with that, I really appreciate you sitting through and chatting with me. I hope that some of this was maybe useful to you, or you at least found enjoyable. My email is right there, so should you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And again, thank you so much for sharing your evening with me.
Thank you, Rachel, for such a fascinating view into what's been going on in conservation. I mean, I had no idea, and really some tremendous efforts, and so many successes, and I know that there's a lot more behind the scenes. I think you've already answered some of the questions. How can someone get involved in conservation activities? And do you need special training, or can anyone participate?
Oh, anyone can participate. Of course, it depends on what you're interested in and what you want to do. Excuse me, what you want to do. But, you know, I mentioned invasive species. Invasive species are a huge threat to our natural resources because they really change and alter the way of everything. So, you know, join an invasive species removal day. You don't need to know how to remove an invasive species or even know how to identify them because they'll teach you.
And so can you find those from like the website?
You can. Yeah, so you know, michigan.gov/DNR, there's an events tab there. You can certainly find things there. Local chapters, local conservation districts. I think one of the best ways to get involved is just to talk with your local government, because there's probably somebody doing something in there.
And I bet your local librarian can help find out those opportunities as well. So call us here at the Troy Public Library and we'll help you locate whatever you might be interested in to get involved with. We do have someone that said this was awesome. So we have recorded tonight's program, so we'll be able to see it again through the City of Troy website. It'll be archived on the library website, and it will be on the library YouTube. So give it a few days, and we'll have a link for that available. So again, Rachel, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. It was a fabulous presentation, and yeah, I think we all learned a lot. So.
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here on a beautiful night, like Rachel said.